Hi, my name is Elle the Elle Estelle, and today I'm going to be showing you how to sew Vogue's V2000, the original DVF wrap dress, re-released. The original Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress was first released in 1974. Since then, it's become an iconic look. I will link more about her history in the notes below, and if you haven't read her memoir, I would highly recommend it. This is a reproduction of the original 1970s wrap dress pattern by Diane von Furstenberg. This is a front wrapped dress 3 inches below the mid-knee or evening length with a fitted bodice, slightly gathered at the front and tucked at the back into the waistline. While you may think that this dress calls for stretch knits, it actually calls for soft fabrics such as challis, chambray, pongee, surah, and single knit such as cotton, jersey, and wool. I ended up using a ponte knit fabric that I found at SR Harris here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. During my search for the perfect fabric, I was looking for all kinds of prints in a variety of different fabrics, including soft weight wovens and suitable knit fabrics. However, while I was searching amongst all these beautiful textured fabrics and prints, this bolt of fabric was literally sticking out, and the color immediately caught my eye. I ended up sewing version A, which is the shorter dress, and it does call for around 4 yards of fabric if you're using a 60-inch wide fabric. However, I ended up not following the cutting instructions. I ended up laying my pattern pieces like I normally do, and I found that the front skirt pattern piece was wider than a 60-inch fabric folded in half. So I ended up having to, after cutting the rest of my pattern pieces, I ended up having to cut my skirt front pieces on a single fold, so not double folded fabric. And by doing that, I ended up running out of fabric. I ended up actually needing an entire 1.5 yards just to cut the length of the belt that I needed. And it was the last pattern piece. So I highly advise following the cutting instructions. Otherwise, you'll need 5.5 yards to cut this dress. I also ended up cutting the shorter length dress, but I still cut off 2 inches from the hem, and then I hemmed it up 2 inches. This dress is great for beginners. It uses absolutely no closures. The only thing that is a little bit tricky is sewing a collar, which is actually very easy to do, as well as sewing the cuffs. And you'll notice that the cuffs have a very distinct look to them. So you'll notice that the sleeves have a pointed cuff with a little button detail that actually keeps it cinched closed. I chose not to have a functioning button, so I simply have a button that is tied through both of the cuffs in order to hold them together. This dress reminds me of Legally Blonde with Reese Witherspoon, and I absolutely love this color. It packs such a punch with such a classic silhouette. This will never go out of style. So you'll notice that it has a tie. This is how the dress is kept closed. And it wraps all the way around the back. So the tie will wrap all the way around the dress. It actually wraps around the front, and the inside wraps through the side seam. So there's actually a hole here in the side seam, and that's where the inside tie comes out and wraps around to the front. So you'll see that there is a facing that goes all the way around from the hem all the way around to the other hem. So the facing is what is needed if you choose not to line the dress. However, you could certainly line the dress with a similar or lightweight fabric, in which case you would not need this facing. What I did find interesting was that the pattern actually called for the interfacing to be used on the fabric itself and not the facing. Usually when you're sewing, you'll sew your interfacing piece to the facing piece. This specific pattern did not call for that. And this pattern was originally designed in the 1970s. So I went along with it and wanted to see what the difference would be to use the interfacing on the facing versus the fabric itself. And I will say, especially with this kind of like heavier knit fabric that I have, it really creates a crisp neckline that I love. And you'll also notice that I chose to do snaps to help keep the dress closed. So I used a smaller snap here at the neckline in order to keep this from opening. And then I used a bigger snap along the waistline in order to prevent the tie from slipping or moving around as I'm moving throughout the day. You could also choose to add a snap here as well on the end of the inside, as well as right along the waist seam here, just like I have right here. I'll link a tutorial on how to tie the wrap dress from Diane von Furstenberg herself. There is a recommended way to tie it in order to make the bow lay flat. You can choose to tie it like this. You can choose to knot it. It's totally up to you. I'll show you a few tips and tricks in this tutorial on how to make your garment look ready-made versus homemade. I have a few tricks on how to get a super flat hemline. You'll notice I end up doing a hand stitch blind hem on this dress. I do top stitching on the cuff as well as the collar. The pattern also called for top stitching along the neckline, but I chose to do an underlining instead to keep the neckline flat and free of any stitching lines. I absolutely love this fabric, and I wanted the fabric and the dress to speak for themselves. That's why I didn't want any extra embellishments. I actually debated about doing the top stitching on the cuff and the collar. I do love it, but I am so glad I didn't do the top stitching along the neckline as well. Depending on your fabric or your preference, you can also choose to do a top stitching along the belt. That will help it keep its shape as well as provide a bit of interest with your stitching line. This dress is super flattering and super special. I cannot wait to show you, so please continue watching to learn more. First, start out by cutting out your pattern pieces. I really strive for my sewing tutorials to be a welcoming addition to the pattern instructions given with the pattern. I know that I'm a very visual person, so I like to see things done. I hope that my added feedback and tips and tricks can give you that added boost to finish your garment. As a reminder, always be sure to double check the length of your garment before cutting. You'll notice a solid line on the bodice pattern that says lengthen or shorten here. That is meant for you to fold or cut your pattern in order to accommodate for a shorter or longer torso length. You'll notice that mine is folded up an inch because I have a shorter torso. For the skirt length, you can always cut the pattern to your desired length from the bottom edge. Doing this before cutting your fabric will end up saving you fabric. Here you'll notice the additional 1.5 yards that I had to purchase in order to cut out the tie. Then, cut out interfacing for the skirt facing, collar, cuff, bodice, and neckline facings. I am using a fusible lightweight knit interfacing to complement my fabric choice. I also chose to cut out and interface all of my collar and cuff pieces as opposed to one side for added stability. Then, before sewing, you will need to fuse your interfacing to the wrong side of your pattern pieces. Here, I am fusing my interfacing to my collar. Be sure to press and hold firmly for at least 10 seconds. Do not slide your iron, but instead lift and hold. This will prevent your fabric and interfacing from warping or creasing. Repeat this for your cuffs as well. I am also going to sew my darts and pleats on the front and back bodice pieces. I am marking my notches and edges of my darts and pleats by cutting a small notch no more than 3/8 of an inch. I am also marking the edge or the point of the line indicated on the pattern with a fabric marking pen. The pen that I'm using is heat erasable, which means it will come out with the use of an iron. Some marking pens are water soluble and others will fade on their own within 24 hours. You'll notice that the front bodice has a bust dart, which means you'll sew from the side seam to the point in one continuous line. Same for the back shoulder dart. However, for the back pleat along the waistline, you will only sew from the edge to the top of the line indicated on the pattern. This will be a straight line that does not come to a point. An important tip to remember when pressing your bust darts is to use a tailor's ham like I'm showing here in order to mimic the curve of the bust. That way, the fabric can be shaped and pressed as flat as possible while being shaped into a curve. You'll notice that I use the flatter edge of the tailor's ham to press the shoulder seams and pleats along the waist seam. This helps me to get the fabric to lay as flat as possible and prevent any wrinkling or creasing. Remember, the seam allowance of any darts, pleats, or seams should normally be pressed down or towards the back of the garment. And like I mentioned earlier, normally you would fuse your inner facing directly to your facing pieces. However, this pattern specifically called for fusing the inner facing to the wrong side of the pattern pieces. So, I trimmed off about 3/8 of an inch along one side of the inner facing for the neckline and skirt facings. That way, the inner facing will most certainly be hidden, even when the facing is folded over. Then, I fused the inner facing directly onto the wrong side of my bodice and skirt pieces. You can choose to do it this way or fuse the inner facing to your facings, in which case you would not need to trim the inner facing. Now it's time to start sewing. With right sides together, match up your back skirt pieces along the center back seam. Sew at 5/8 of an inch and finish the raw edges. I'm using a walking foot attachment for my machine since I'm using a thicker knit fabric. That way, my fabric will have an easier time going through my sewing machine, and there will be less of a chance for my fabric to get warped or distorted. Then, to finish my seam allowances, I'm using my serger with a matching thread color. If you don't have a serger, most machines have a zigzag or a serger-like stitching pattern that you can use. Or, you can use pinking shears, which will cut the edges of your fabric in a zigzag pattern, which prevents your fabric from fraying. Choosing to finish your seam allowances with a stitching pattern or serger is a great way to ensure that even if your seam comes undone, your second stitching line will prevent any embarrassing wardrobe malfunctions. Don't forget to press your seams when you're done. Pressing your seams is what takes your garment from homemade to you made that? Now, sew the back bodice piece to the skirt back pieces. Notice how nicely my darts and pleats are pressed, and I've got my inner facing attached to my back neckline. With wrong sides together, sew your bodice to your skirt at 5/8 of an inch. Finish and press the seam allowance. Now we're going to sew the front bodice pieces to the front skirt pieces. With the right sides together, match up your bodice and skirt along the waist seam. Be sure to match up your notches. You'll notice that the front bodice is a little bit wider than the skirt. That's because there is a dashed line indicated on the front bodice pieces that say gather. To gather the bodice, sew a row or two of stitches with your longest stitch length possible, also called a basting stitch, along this line. Do not backstitch. Instead, leave thread tails at least 2 inches on both ends. That way, you can pull on your bottom thread and gather the fabric. Then, your bodice and skirt pieces should match up. You'll sew your seam at 5/8 of an inch and finish the raw edges. Repeat for the other side as well. Now, take 2 of your cuff pieces and match them up with wrong sides together. Notice how both of my cuff pieces are interfaced. That's because I've interfaced all of my cuff pieces, not just 2. With a lightweight interfacing like I'm using, it will add a little bit more stability without unnecessary bulk. Sew the pieces together along the sides and outer edge at 5/8 of an inch. Repeat for the other cuff. Then, do the same for the collar. Notice again that I've interfaced both pieces as opposed to one. If you do interface only one side, the piece that is interfaced will end up being the piece that is on the outside, so that the more stable piece is what can be seen. Once you've sewn your collar and cuff pieces together, trim the excess seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch. Along the points, trim off the pointed edge, and if necessary, cut out notches into the fabric so that your corners will lay as flat and square as possible. Fold your collar right side out and press all of the edges as square and flat as possible. Repeat this for both cuffs as well. Here I'm using a tailor's pressing board in order to press along the pointed edges. If you don't have one, using a pointed but blunt object like a chopstick can help get your corners as square as possible. Press along all of the edges as well to get a professional finish. At this point, you can choose to do top stitching along these sewn edges as well. Here I'm sewing one continuous line at about 1/4 inch from the folded edge. We're going to repeat these same principles for the tie. Taking one of the ties, fold it in half with right sides together and sew along the long edge at 5/8 inch, as well as the straight pointed edge. But be sure to leave the smaller curved edge open. Repeat for the other tie. Then you'll trim the seam allowances down to 1/4 inch and clip the corners off. Then pull the tie through the opening so that the right sides are out. Press the seams and corners flat. Top stitch along the edges if you would like. When pressing the seam, I found it easier to use a wooden yardstick to press the seam open first. Then I was able to fold and press the seam edge in half to get a more precise finish. Next, you'll want to sew your shoulder seams together at 5/8 inch like this. Then you can attach your collar to your neckline, matching up the notches and markings. Then match up the notches on your belt and sew your belt to the front edge of your dress at the waist seam like this. Sew the collar and belt on at 5/8 inch, but don't worry about finishing your seam allowances yet. Then, with right sides together, sew your back neckline, and front skirt facing pieces together at 5/8 inch. Finish and press your seam allowances. Now you can sew your facing to your dress with right sides together. Sew at 5/8 inch and finish your raw edges. Like I mentioned earlier, I chose not to do a top stitching line along my neckline and front skirt. Instead, I did a method called understitching, which is demonstrated here. By pressing your seam allowances to the right and stitching evenly at about 1/4 of an inch from your seam, the stitching will hold your facing and seam allowance together to create a more defined and crisp seam. When your facing is pressed under, not only will the heat from your iron press your neckline into place, you will now have a stitching line to secure it even more. Your facing will then look like this. Now you can sew your side seams together at 5/8 of an inch. However, on the right side seam, be sure to leave an opening as indicated by the triangle markings on your pattern. This opening will be where your belt will go through in order to wrap around. Sew both seams at 5/8 of an inch, but be sure to finish your seam allowances separately on the right side so that your seam allowances can be pressed open and the opening can be used. Here you can see I'm serging both edges of the seam allowance separately and then pressing open the seam allowances here with my iron. We're almost done. Lastly are the sleeves. Sew a basting stitch along the top edges of your sleeve in between the small circles as indicated on your pattern. This will help to ease the sleeve into the armhole. You'll notice that I fused a 2-inch strip of interfacing to the bottom edge of my sleeve. This was done in order to help keep the bottom edge of my sleeve as straight and crisp as possible, though it's not necessary if you're adding the cuff. With right sides together, sew your sleeves along the side seams at 5/8 of an inch and finish your raw edges like this. Press the seams towards the back. The back is indicated by the 2 notches on your armhole. Then attach your cuff to your sleeve with the right sides together, matching up the notches. I found that the bottom edge of my sleeve was wider than the width of my cuff. Now I couldn't find a reason for this, as the cuff did not indicate any special seam allowances, nor did the pattern instructions acknowledge this difference. So, in order to get my cuff to touch from end to end, I ended up making my sleeve a little narrower in order to compensate. You'll see here that's why I have 2 rows of stitching. I still serged my seam allowance on my sleeve before attaching the cuff. Then, take the sleeve facing piece and fold it in half with right sides together. Sew at 5/8 of an inch along the shorter edge and finish the raw edges. Then, you can attach the facing to the cuff with right sides together like this. Sew the facing, cuff, and sleeves together at 5/8 of an inch. It should then look like this. Here, I did another example of understitching to finish my facing. However, I found the 4 layers of fabric to be especially bulky. So, before understitching, I trimmed my cuff seam allowance down to about 1/4 of an inch. I left the facing and sleeve seam allowances at 5/8 of an inch. This helped tremendously to cut down the bulky seam. Then I understitched as best as I could to finish the facing. Finally, to secure the edge of the facing, I did a hand-stitched blind hem all the way around. That way, I could be certain that you would not be able to see the stitches on the right side of the fabric, even if they were going to be covered up by the cuff. Now it's time to attach your sleeves to your dress. Matching up the notches and gathering the top edge of your sleeve as necessary, sew your sleeve to your bodice at 5/8 of an inch, making sure there are no puckers. Finish the seam allowance at 5/8 of an inch and press the seam. Repeat for the other side. The last step is to hem your dress. I cut off 2 inches from the hem and then turned up the hem another 2 inches. Remember that wooden yardstick that I used earlier? In order to create an even more crisp edge, I pressed my seam allowance with my iron and then held the yardstick down on top while it was cooling. The heat is absorbed into the wood and the fabric result is a more permanent press. There is a tool called a clapper, which is essentially a block of wood to do the same function. If you don't have one, a wooden yardstick works just fine. You will see me use an organza pressing cloth in order to make sure I don't burn my fabric. Hand stitch your hem and facing for a couture finish. I tacked down my facing at the seams by hand so that it would stay down, but you could also do a blind hem hand stitched all the way around for extra security. Finally, the finishing touches. Sew a button of your choice to your cuff along the top pointed edge. Sew through both of the cuffs in order to secure them together. Or, if you would like, you can sew a buttonhole and a button to make it functioning. I also chose to add a snap to the neckline and the waist seam in order to make my dress more secure and comfortable. The final result is a timeless, beautiful dress. I love my wrap dress so much. I'm already thinking about what fabric I'm going to use for my next one. Let me know what you think about this pattern in the comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe. Until next time.